Let's see. We at least got through to YouTube. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make sure I got this link on my Facebook page so people can watch. And now we're off. So let me get to my screen here, and I can share my screen of the post. There we go. And we're going to do here. Oops, what did it just do? Okay. So we're going to talk about prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace tonight. Let me make sure I got the right video. There we go. And prospects for peace in 2020. So there are a number of major issues that make Israeli-Palestinian peace, long-term peace, a resolution, I should say, difficult to achieve. And one of them is mutual doubts about the sincerity of the leaders in the peace process. So, for example, the percent of Israelis who say that the Israeli government is making a sincere effort toward peace, 56% of Jews say yes. Of Arabs, 72% say no. Percent in Israel who say that the Palestinian leadership is making a sincere effort toward peace. 88% of Jews say no, and 40% of Arabs say no, or 50% say yes. So we have a very skewed situation in which each side doesn't believe that the other side's leadership is really making a sincere effort. The basic issue that comes up, and I try to explain this in every context, the basic issue that comes up is nothing is going to change unless the alternative is better than maintaining the status quo. And this is true from both sides. If you're in a situation in which whatever is being offered is not as good as the status quo for either side, whichever side it's worse for is going to oppose it. If it's worse for both sides, they're both going to oppose it. So the only thing that can make it better is something that is better than maintaining the status quo. So the current situation, and this has been the current situation for a while. I've done this presentation really for a few years already in various forms, and it's posted to a certain extent on the weareforisrael.org website as a current resolution to the conflict. So what is possible for Israel to concede in regard to resolutions of the conflict is not enough for the Palestinian side to prioritize reaching an agreement over and above continuing to fight or continuing to disagree. And what is demanded by the Palestinian side is seen as more harmful by Israeli leaders than continuing to face violence and anti-Israel activism. Just plain and simple, that's where it is. This has been ongoing since at least the beginning of the Oslo process in the 90s. And realistically, the Oslo process was started because it was seen as better than maintaining the status quo at that point. But then as things moved on, not necessarily after 2000. Jumping ahead a little bit, we go to President Obama, May of 2011. And you see why I'm going to go here as this develops. President Obama in May of 2011 said that borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps so that secure and recognized borders are established for both states. Okay, now, this seems like a fairly simple statement. It seems like it should make sense based on a two-state solution. And what two states are you talking about? You're basically talking about the 1967 lines. That's the idea, right? It's much more complicated than that. This is not an obvious thing at all when you look at the details. The idea that there is an obvious solution to the conflict with generally agreed upon parameters misrepresents the reality, period. There may be certain people who like certain parameters, but it's not generally accepted on either side. There are 5 main issues that need to be addressed. Jerusalem, the right of return, borders, the West Bank and Gaza, and the Jordanian border. And each of those contain a number of sub-issues, including things like what level of military the Palestinian side would have in the West Bank or Gaza, all sorts of other things that'll go along, and we'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so let's talk about Jerusalem. There's no solution that addresses the reality in Jerusalem that can please both sides. And there are many solutions that would result in nightmare scenarios for the future. And we'll go into these in more detail as we go on. Jerusalem is already culturally divided. Some people who argue for a division of Jerusalem argue essentially, here are the Arabs over here in the east side, here are the Jews on the west side. And it should be simple, but that's not how it works, okay? Doing nothing could also be a bad option. I'll go into details for some of these things in a little bit. While the right of return of Palestinian refugees to homes in Israel is almost certainly not a viable possibility, no alternative is likely to be politically, much less religiously acceptable to Palestinians. It's hard for them to yield this officially under any circumstances. And so it's constantly brought up in some way or another as an issue. And this is certainly true for some Palestinians more than others. I'm not going to say that there's any unanimity on the Palestinian side, but for many Palestinians, this is still a major issue. The 1967 lines. There may have been discussions about territorial swaps, quote unquote, based on the 1967 lines, but there are numerous problems that are obfuscated by that simple summation. We'll get into those in a little bit. The West Bank and Gaza. Movement of people between Gaza and the West Bank may be necessary for Palestinian unity, but it is a security nightmare for both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And there are a lot of issues that are connected to that. Finally, Israeli control over the Jordanian border seems to be mandatory for the foreseeable future in order to meet current security concerns. And that means that the Palestinians don't have control in the West Bank, don't have control of any border because they'd be completely surrounded by Israeli control. Okay, but those are just the basic issues. Okay. Now, a lot of people say that international forces could step in here. International forces have all failed miserably to halt sectarian violence everywhere. Suggestions that any such force could step in and prevent Islamic militants from moving into the West Bank and causing problems for both the Palestinian Authority and Israel are laughable. Not going to happen. So if you put international force controlling the Jordanian border and armed militants rush the border, there is no chance that anything would stop them, or if they snuck across the border or any number of other things, it just would not work. Okay. International forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the Sinai, Sudan, and other places in the region have proven incompetent in maintaining security, preventing rearming of militant groups, or even in preventing major wars and even genocides. This means that any agreement will necessarily have troops on the Jordanian border for a long time into the future. And when different agreements or possible agreements have been put forward, this has been one of the major problems that people have pointed out immediately on the Palestinian side, that whatever you're talking about, if they have no border control, you're not talking about a sovereign state. Now, there's a question about that, what constitutes sovereignty, and to what extent they would have to have border control. But you're dealing with something in the West Bank in particular that's not going to have full border control, if any border control at all, external border control at all from the start. Jordan really wants the IDF there also. And for the same reason that Egypt has closed tunnels between Gaza and Sinai, namely to keep militants out of the country. If you have militants moving back and forth between Jordan and the West Bank, or between Egypt and Gaza, you're going to end up with instability on both sides of the border, on both sides of both of those borders. That's just the reality. You're going to have people trying to smuggle weapons into the West Bank or smuggle weapons into Gaza. You're going to have militants going out through those borders. And when you're dealing with Jordan, where you have a majority Palestinian population, you could potentially have some very serious instability problems east of the border in Jordan, if you allowed movement back and forth across that border fairly easily. Movement between the northern and southern West Bank could easily be ensured, even if access between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea was maintained by Israel. However, with the level of militancy in Gaza at present, traffic between the Palestinian territories would need to be closely monitored. There's no way that people could simply be allowed to travel through Israeli territory on their way to and from Gaza at this point. In other words, you're not going to have people traveling between the southern West Bank and Gaza without any Israeli control. And to be honest, the Palestinian Authority would be concerned about it also, because the Palestinian Authority is run by Fatah. That's not the same political party as Hamas. They're rivals. And to a certain extent, they've been fighting a civil war that's only not a hot war because Israel is in between them. So if you had easy transport between Gaza and the southern West Bank, you would potentially have instability in the southern West Bank, and you could potentially have major violence problems among Palestinians in those territories. So you're talking about a situation that's not necessarily to the advantage of the Palestinian Authority either. There are ways to substantially increase economic cooperation between the territories, between the West Bank and Gaza. But because of the weaponry available in Gaza right now, all shipments would need to be closely monitored for years going forward from a peace agreement. You do not want Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza arming militants in the West Bank and allowing them to conduct rocket attacks and all sorts of other things against Israel from the West Bank. That would be a nightmare scenario. So that's not a possibility. Okay, so one of the things that has been discussed is this idea of borders and swaps. The basis of the idea of territorial swaps is that the Palestinians need enough territory and the proper kind of territory to form a viable state. It's not that the Palestinians are entitled to all of what was Jordanian occupied territory 1948 to 1967. That's just not what the scenario actually is. It's a misunderstanding to begin from that, from the perspective that the Palestinians are entitled to all of the land to begin with. The 1967 lines weren't secure. Israel has to have secure borders after a peace agreement. Without them, future violence is ensured, and any agreement that the two sides reach won't be worth the paper on which it is written. It's going to collapse. You're going to have war, and then you're going to have to start all over from a much worse position, really, probably for both sides. The 1967 lines were far from secure, and it's just not going to work. Okay. So let me move this little image here so I can clear the text. The separation barrier, with some possible exceptions, runs along the path that provides necessary security against terrorism that Israel requires. Thus, it's the current route of the separation barrier, not the 67 lines, that's the most viable basis for negotiations. It's what Israel's really going to look at. There are right now even settlements and outposts that are on the other side of what a normal, simple direction of that barrier would be. The barrier can be moved. There are opportunities for the path of the barrier to be moved during negotiations, and some settlements and outposts could end up on the Palestinian side of that border. That's been part of the discussion. And to be honest, that would be the case whether or not the Israeli government recognizes them, whether or not the Israeli government today decides to annex them. Any of those things could change in negotiations, really can. So it's important to understand that facts on the ground make it more difficult. As facts on the ground change, they make it more difficult for either side to concede things, but they don't necessarily make it impassable. The difficulty of the process is going to go back, the difficulty of concession is going to go back to that status quo issue, status quo question at the beginning. It's much more difficult. It's much more difficult to concede the status quo if the status quo is better than what you're looking at. So as Israel continues to improve its situation relative to the Palestinians as regarding land, it's going to be more difficult for Israel to then concede going backwards and concede more to the Palestinians. So that's part of the issue there. Okay. The idea of territorial swaps itself is problematic because it implies two falsehoods. First, it implies that the Palestinians have a right to negotiate from a position that they never held, which is authoritative control over the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Judea in the south, Samaria in the north, and that their claim to that much land, much less all of that specific land, is superior to Israel's claim to it. This is not true. Okay, that's part of the problem, is it's not true. Control matters. While there may be public sentiment that the Palestinians should have the ability to negotiate from this position, it is a legal fiction. Control of the land is an obviously essential characteristic of any valid claim to it. Legal control passed from the Ottomans to the British to Jordan to Israel, with each in turn applying its own national laws to the territory demonstrating control. As you will note, there is no Palestinian state at any point in that sequence. And this is vitally important because that's how the legal control of the land is established. Big problem for this idea. The concept of territorial swaps would involve trading one piece of land for another. So would the Palestinians really consider land near Gaza or abutting the southern part of the West Bank as equivalent to neighborhoods around Jerusalem or in the Galilee? The answer to that is obviously not. That makes no sense at all. You're not talking about real swaps. You're not going to trade anything. So you're really talking about the extent, the amount of territory, and even that is awkward. And the only possibility of really talking about swaps would be Arab cities within Israel becoming part of a Palestinian state, which has been discussed. But guess what? The populations of those Arab cities within Israel do not want to be on the Palestinian side. You could make the argument that that is ethnic cleansing. And even if it's done because the Palestinians want them on their side, it's a problem. The same is true with East Jerusalem. I know people want to say that East Jerusalem should necessarily be part of a Palestinian state, but there are also Arab Israelis who live in those areas who don't want to be part of that. They'd rather be connected to Israel. So you have a big problem with this. Okay. The right of return would seem to be the easiest of the problems to overcome. There's no way that Israel can bring in hundreds of thousands, much less several million Palestinians and maintain the character of Israel as a Jewish state. Neither can Israel bring in hundreds of thousands of people hostile to its existence and not face civil war and strife. And guess what? The Palestinian state can't afford to bring them in either because the impact on their economy would be massive. So unless you're bringing in people who are wealthy professionals and business people, which I'm sure the Palestinian state would love to do, you're going to increase the burden on the state, and you're not necessarily going to improve the state. And they don't want to do that because they're already going to struggle when they start. So you're just not going to see that. Reasonable alternatives to the right of return include restitution. Restitution is compensation for damage done, for property lost. But any settlement, any financial settlement for properties would be likely far less than actual value today, and would certainly not be preferable in many cases to ownership of the land. Just as a way of comparison, when you're dealing with restitution, Holocaust survivors have received millions of dollars in restitution for losses which at the time of the restitution agreement were worth well into the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. You're talking about a very small fraction. Restitution is made essentially in relation to the amount at the time it was lost, without all of the rest of interest and everything else and damages on top of that. And it's just not going to be enough to compensate. Then you also have the fact that Israelis who came from Arab lands would need to be compensated similarly for the same reason. So restitution itself may be problematic, because if the Palestinian refugees are deemed worthy because they were forced to leave their homes, or even just left their homes in war, and other people seized their property, so are hundreds of thousands of Jews forced to flee from Arab lands. There are people who even argue that the value of the property lost by Jews who were forced to leave Arab lands is greater than the value of the property lost by Arabs who were living in Palestine, who then had to leave, or were forced to leave their property behind. So big problem there. Finally, relation to Jerusalem. There's no resolution to the situation in Jerusalem that is going to please both sides, and there are few solutions that will maintain the security of the city, its economic and civil and civic viability as a functioning city, and access to its archaeological and holy sites for people of all faiths. Jews will be able to securely access the old city of Jerusalem with its holy sites only if they remain under Israeli sovereignty. That was proven by the time period before Israeli sovereignty. It's proven by the places that Israel yielded to the Palestinians when the Palestinian Authority was created. So when you're looking at holy sites in Hebron, for example, big problem. So there are only certain ways that this would work. There's no way to maintain the security in the area of the Holy Basin. You can sit there and have all kinds of theories about how things would work. All you have to do is go there and look around. The area centered on the Temple Mount. Unless Israel controls the entire basin from the top of the hill of the Mount of Olives to the west, neither is it possible for Silwan to the south of the Temple Mount to be under Palestinian control for the same reason. I mean, you're looking west, you're looking east here from the Mount of Olives. Okay, this is east of the Temple Mount. You're looking straight up a giant hill. Okay, that's the Mount of Olives. This is Silwan to the south. You can look way far in the distance there. But way far in the distance there is nothing for a high-powered rifle. Right? You're dealing with a terrorism problem. You're dealing with militants who were armed by Iran and other countries with weaponry that could easily fire that distance. And if you are simply firing into gathered crowds, it's not difficult. It really is not. It would be a problem for Israelis to have to maintain security if there were Palestinians in the intervening area also. This is really, really difficult. So the unity of that and the unified security of that is very important. This is directly south of the Temple Mount, the area of Silwan. In fact, this area here to the lower right of the screen is the city of David. And it has actually been changed quite a bit over the last few years. This picture is probably old and it doesn't look like this anymore, but that's the general idea of where it is. This is a map of the city of David going down the hill from the Temple Mount. It extends fairly far. I make the comment that the city of David right now is actually owned by a private organization. It really is kind of the exemplar of a territory that should be owned by the national government and provided as a public national heritage place for everybody. It is the definition of a World Heritage Area. And so fighting over the politics of who gets to live on top of it doesn't make any sense at all. There really should be no one living on top of it. So the area of that is a problem. There's a lot of development that's going on there as far as the archaeological site. It's actually a really neat archaeological site to see. The Roman road is preserved. You can walk up the hill on the Roman road, which right now goes beneath buildings that are above it still that have been maintained in order to maintain the housing of the people who live there and to avoid conflicts relation to the Israeli government. It's a very neat area, but it's definitely a National Historic Site. Access to the old city is a huge issue. The entire city of David connected to Silwan should be a national controlled archaeological park and a major tourist site. The area between the northern access to the Temple Mount and Hebrew University on Mount Scopus must also realistically remain under Israeli sovereignty, or Hebrew University will be cut off from the rest of Jerusalem, which is what was the case from the time of the War of Independence to the 1967 war. One could argue, and many do, that the neighborhood of Issawiya in the northeast of Mount Scopus could be put under Palestinian sovereignty, along with the area to the southeast of Silwan, such as Abu Dis. These seem to be the areas that are included on the Palestinian side in proposed peace agreements, and that would function as a Palestinian capital. We partly know this because Mahmoud Abbas has come out and said, the Palestinian Authority president has come out and said that he's not going to settle for Abu Dis as the Palestinian capital. So we can be fairly certain that that's part of what's been offered. And it makes sense when you look at the map that that's what you're going to be dealing with. So when you're looking at these areas, you're looking at areas that are, if you look at this map here, you see this green tree in the middle of the red area of Jerusalem there. Southeast of that, east of that is the Mount of Olives. Southeast of that is Abu Dis. You can see straight east Ma'ale Adumim, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Mount Scopus to the northeast, just west of where it says Ma'ale Adumim on this map. That area is all a significant problem for discussions. And we will see on this map here with E1, there's this territory called, so if you're looking at this map, you're looking at area east of the old city of Jerusalem. The old city of Jerusalem is on the western portion of this map where you see all these little triangles there. You see it says Jewish Quarter on the map. And if you keep going east a little bit, you'll see the ridge. Okay, you see a ridge and then you hit some Palestinian neighborhoods. And you see Abu Dis there, kind of in the center, toward the bottom of the map. Let's see, Issawiya in the north of the map, right on the edge of the map in the north is the other neighborhood that we're talking about. Those are the closest areas to the old city that kind of would be relatively reasonable, would not be security problems. You know, are there possible ways? I mean, Sheikh Jarrah is also a serious issue that the Israelis and the Palestinians need to discuss. It could be that Sheikh Jarrah is also included in this. It's kind of in the middle at the moment, and there are all sorts of different problems with municipal issues there, as well as potential security problems. So Sheikh Jarrah could also be a place that is under negotiation. But the situation here is that you would have to have a certain amount of unification and security control of this portion of Jerusalem in order for there to be any realistic security, in order for tourism to work at all. That's an issue. Then you've got E1, and look and see where E1 is. East of E1, you have Ma'ale Adumim. There's a very large Israeli settlement area. It's basically a very large suburb of Jerusalem. It's a major suburb of Jerusalem that has tens of thousands of people in it. There's an area called E1 that's in the middle. Now, the issue with E1 is that it's an obvious connector between the north and the south for a Palestinian state. It's what is going to be a direct route from the southern areas of southern suburbs of Jerusalem, going down to Bethlehem, going up to the areas northeast of Jerusalem and north of Jerusalem, and then connecting over to Ramallah. If you put that completely on the Israeli side, it causes a number of problems. So here's the issue with E1. E1 really makes sense for both sides. It's an area that would make sense to be included on the territory of each side. To place it on either side of the barrier would cause a major problem. If it's on the Palestinian side, then Ma'ale Adumim becomes an island surrounded by Palestinian territory. No Israeli government is going to be able to allow that. If E1 remains Israeli, someone traveling from Bethlehem to Ramallah through Abu Dis and Anata would have to travel at least 10 additional miles to do so, going around Ma'ale Adumim, unless a road were constructed that allowed travelers to cross from south to north through E1. And basically, such a road or tunnel would become essential in such a scenario. It's very doable. If you're talking about a long-term peace, you can figure this out. So in essence, what we end up with is something that is near the status quo really makes the most sense. A lot of this stuff is already close to the status quo. So you're talking about granting more territory to the Palestinians, for example. Observer status, essentially similar to what we've got now, is an ideal for the reality. And I explain this in a second. You can call it something differently. I mean, certainly it can be enhanced, but this idea that you're going to have a fully sovereign state that controls borders and all this stuff is just not possible for the foreseeable future for a lot of reasons. Security is a major issue. External border control by Israel allows for more relaxed interior border control and therefore for economic cooperation and interaction. If you are looking at how these economies work, the Palestinians need to work in Israel. They need economic cooperation within Israel, or things are going to be a major problem. If there's external border control, you can have somewhat lessened interior border control. If you have increased internal border control, you could potentially prohibit Palestinians from working in Israel and hamper tourism into the Palestinian territories. I mean, think about this. If you have internal security within Israel that allows for Palestinians to come into Israel, let's say if it's an hour even, that may be long, it may be inconvenient, but it may be doable. But what happens if you have 3 hours? What happens if every bag, every parcel, every car needs to be stopped, x-rayed, every person searched, every box opened? You have to have dogs sniff everything because you could potentially have significant bombs coming in. You have to analyze every person who's coming across the border to make sure that they're not giving you a fake identity and all that. I mean, a lot of this stuff happens anyway. A lot of it happens anyway, but you can imagine vastly increased security that would be necessary if you're constantly worried about terrorists trying to get from Syria through Jordan into the West Bank into Israel. I mean, that's just the way it is. It would be very problematic. Okay, over 100,000 Palestinians currently work in Israel. Peace would dramatically increase that total. In fact, there was even an article the other day just to show you how relaxed the security is now. There was an article the other day in which some of the Palestinian leaders were complaining that COVID-19 came into the West Bank because Palestinian workers were coming into Israel, getting infected, and then going back into the West Bank, even under the lockdown. Okay, so I mean, this gives you an idea of what the situation is. Palestinian prosperity is directly tied to limited Israeli border control. And I mean, between Judea and Samaria and the rest of Israel. Okay, that's the border that I'm talking about. If Israel has to tighten that border, then everything going on in the Palestinian side, the Palestinian Authority's territory, is going to be worse. You can just compare it to what's going on in Gaza. If it's really difficult for people to come in and out of Israel and for products to come in and out of Israel, you're going to have much worse economic scenario. If Israel maintains external border control, the Palestinians need only maintain an internal police force. So honestly, this is better. It's less expensive for the Palestinians, but it does not give them full sovereignty, or what would traditionally be full sovereignty. They will not be able to have an army that can do whatever the heck it wants and control its borders. Not going to happen. It's just not a possibility. Palestinians are and will continue to be dependent on Israel to provide water and electricity. The primary source of water will increasingly shift toward desalinated water piped in from the Mediterranean Sea rather than from freshwater sources, which are limited. Although right now the Kinneret is actually at the highest it's been in 30 years. And Israel's water situation is probably as good as it's been maybe in the history of the country. But that's still a situation in which the Palestinians are dependent on Israel. And when you're talking about electricity, both the West Bank and while things could improve, you're not going to have the same level of electricity available on both sides of the border. Just not going to happen again. Gaza will continue to be cut off so long as a government hostile to both Israel and Egypt is in power. Because remember, Egypt is controlling its border with Gaza and has that border sealed. It's not just Israel who's got Gaza's border closed. Palestinian unity is diplomatic. They talk about it. The Hamas and Fatah can work together in negotiating peace. It's really a fiction. This is not political. It's not cultural. It's not religious. Hamas and Fatah are actually in opposition to one another. If you've been to any of my lectures talking about the Arab world and you hear me talk about nationalists versus Islamists, political Islamists, Hamas is a political Islamist movement. Fatah is a nationalist movement. They're rivals everywhere in the Arab world. And they're going to butt heads constantly. So the fact that they butt heads in these territories makes perfect sense because they butt heads regionally. Unity is necessary for appearances at the UN and to negotiate for all people. But I tend to think that what you're going to eventually see are negotiations that are based on the individual territories rather than on the entirety. In other words, the Palestinians living in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, are going to be treated, are going to negotiate with Israel separately from Gaza. Gaza is going to have to be treated differently because it's got different scenario, it's got different government, and it's really realistically not going to change. Some of the scenarios have Hamas willing to let Fatah govern, but they're not willing to disarm, which means they're still basically running it. So that's not going to change. Mahmoud Abbas was elected to a 4-year term in 2005. So you really don't even have a functionally elected leadership in the West Bank, and Hamas, same thing. So you haven't had, you don't necessarily know that the leadership you've got is representative of the people anywhere in the Palestinian territories. Israel has elected a right-wing government over and over and over for reasons having nothing to do with the peace process, but which will significantly hamper progress in the peace process. When Israelis believed that a peace agreement was possible, they elected a moderate left government. That was the case in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. When Israelis believed that there was no chance of that and their primary threats were terrorism and Iran, the Israelis elected a right-wing government, and they don't have faith at all in the left. In fact, the left is barely registering anything. What used to be the main bloc of the political left in Israel is barely even registering in the election right now. Their credibility is in trouble. And an overwhelming percentage of the Israeli government now is essentially what we would normally call center-right. And you'll see that in the coalition negotiations are way tipped in that direction. Now, you still have a secular versus religious discussion, but you really do not have a big push toward negotiating peace anytime soon with a huge block of the Israeli electorate. It's just not there. Israel's continued difficulty even forming a coalition is likely to eliminate any possibility of substantial development toward making any concessions in relation to a peace process. It's much more likely, in fact, to involve concessions made to right-wing religious parties or right-wing settler parties in order to help bolster the coalition on the right, because that's how they've been maintaining power. The opposition may well have as their primary argument just simply asking for maintaining the status quo and not annexing territory officially. I mean, that seems to be what the Blue-White Party is actually asking for. Please don't annex and we'll come into the coalition. So as far as the idea that you're suddenly going to have a push toward a peace agreement, it's just not there. Maintaining the status quo may be the best that those who are seeking a two-state solution can achieve right now. And by right now, I don't think this is just this month or this year. It may be for years to come, because you're also going to deal with a significant leadership transition among the Palestinians when Mahmoud Abbas ceases to be the leader, and that could take years to sort out. It may not sort out in months, it may be years, and maybe a number of years before that sorts out. If Prime Minister Netanyahu ceases to be the Prime Minister of Israel, who knows how that is going to sort out. Anytime you have changes, you're going to have an impact on stability, and stability is what you need to negotiate this kind of peace. So any instability is going to mean that the status quo is going to last for a while. Or potentially worsen, frankly, as far as a peace agreement goes. Because in order to form coalitions, as I have just said, reaching right seems to be the more effective way, and the right wing is not as strong in favor of any kind of an agreement at all, and certainly not of concessions. So realistically, negotiations now are about how and when the Palestinians may begin to govern more territory, and what access they'll have to Israeli-controlled territories and resources. If the negotiations were about that, I think you could potentially have a good bit of progress even now, even with a Netanyahu government. I think you'd have a good bit of support from the other side in the Israeli government. And if the United States pushed that, I think they could get somewhere. If you're dealing with an attempt to achieve some sort of final resolution, and create a sovereign Palestinian state and all of that stuff, I can't see that happening. I just don't see that as anything that's achievable in what I would consider a reasonable near term. And this is a far cry from the international understanding. There are just a lot of groups and governments that want to act as if a two-state solution could be achieved tomorrow. And I'm telling you, it's not reasonably achievable within a few years. So we're dealing with a situation that is going to have to be um, uh, is going to have to look to compromise. It's going to have to look to attempts to make baby steps toward a better situation, to improve the status quo. And things that'll improve the status quo will eventually result in peace. Peace could potentially here just happen if the right steps are taken. It may not be possible to achieve an agreement. But right now, I mean, things are vastly better for both Israelis and Palestinians than they have been in many periods for decades. And there's a lot of prosperity going on. In fact, one of the issues I think that the Palestinians actually face right now is that there's enough prosperity in the West Bank that any kind of significant upheaval in order to fight Israel really is not going to happen. Their people are just not willing to do that, to jeopardize what they have in order to try to pressure Israel for something that they don't think is possible anyway. And so that means it's much more difficult. And then when you look at the broader situation in the region, and I've lectured on this quite a bit, and I don't really have the ability to do so tonight, the other Arab countries really are interested in working with Israel. And because of that, they're not willing to put as much pressure on Israel as they have in the past. And in fact, they're putting pressure on the Palestinians to try to make concessions in order to be able to move forward, and basically telling the Palestinians that if they don't make an agreement sometime soon, they're going to move forward with Israel anyway. That scenario is certainly not conducive to the Palestinians being able to pressure Israel to make concessions. In fact, I think the Palestinians are worried that they can't pressure Israel to do anything at all. They need international help to do it, and the countries that could potentially help them in pressuring Israel are not interested in doing so. They're much more interested in working with Israel. So the Palestinians don't have as much to offer other countries as Israel does. And many of the countries that used to be aligned, in addition to the Arab countries, no longer are. Israel even has a good relationship with Russia, which used to be, the major party on the other side. So the Palestinian negotiating position is not good. The Israeli position is extraordinarily strong relative to where it's ever been, and that does not bode well for improvement for the status quo on both sides. So baby steps do need to take place, and there are ideas whether or not President Trump's peace plan is acceptable in its entirety to either side is a different story. But there certainly are ideas that within it that may be able to improve the situation for both sides, and that may help improve the situation. I think realistically, you're looking at improving the situation for both sides in small steps. I think that's the most that can be achieved right now. So attempts to force a final agreement are going to fail because progress isn't possible now, and failure of negotiations has always resulted in violence and economic harm, along with decreased prospects for improvement going forward. No one wants to risk that. No one is going to take any steps that could potentially do that. Hamas has tried to push over the last few years with attempting to get violence to happen on the border in order to spur other things happening other places. And what you found is when Hamas did these violent protests on the Gaza border, nothing happened in the West Bank. Life went on as usual. It didn't cause anything. It was totally ineffective in getting that done. It didn't change the scenario between Israel and Hamas either. It didn't change the scenario between Israel and the world community. So essentially at this point right now, the use of violence and harm to Palestinian civilians, even by risking children, by sending them into areas of harm, is not resulting in any positive impact for the Palestinian side. And Israel's technology is improving to the point where its response is not doing as much damage, but it's very effective. And because of that, the scenarios, the Palestinians' ability even to use violence to change the situation are not significant anymore. So things aren't bad enough to encourage change. That's really what the scenario is. They're not bad enough to encourage change, really, for either side. And so you need to add some incentives, ideally positive incentives, to get the sides to move forward in a way where they're willing to work together. Gaza continues to suffer terribly because of Egyptian border closures and the inability to access Israeli and other markets. The World Bank and the UN tend to include Gaza in all analyses of the Palestinian economy, which dramatically worsens any picture of the Palestinian economy. Gaza is in terrible shape, but the West Bank isn't. So if you separate the two, you see that the West Bank is vastly better. The gross domestic product in the West Bank, for example, grew by more than 8% annually from 2009 to 2012. It slowed significantly in 2013, recovered in 2014, and it's been doing pretty well. Unemployment's relatively high. Economic success is not distributed. There are some extremely wealthy Palestinians living in the West Bank. If you drive on the roads north of Jerusalem and you head to Modi'in, okay, you go across the area near Ramallah, you will see some very nice houses in the Palestinian territory. There are wealthy Palestinians. The economic success is not equal across the population. The wealthy in the West Bank, many of the wealthy in the West Bank are extremely wealthy, but the poor in the West Bank are extremely poor, and there are a lot more of them. In Gaza, the same thing is true to an even greater extreme. And so, although the wealthiest people aren't in Gaza, wealthiest people are in the West Bank. So the situation is you know, the Palestinians need to distribute wealth better, but it's not enough to change because they're actually doing better than other places around the world. So observer state status, which is essentially where they are right now in the UN, in relation to the UN, and an agreement with Israel would lead to an economic explosion in the West Bank. You're going to have dramatically increased cooperation, business interaction, tourism, all sorts of other things that would bring in a tremendous amount of wealth into the West Bank, but it may not lead to anything related to Gaza at all, because it may not change the situation for Gaza. Things in Gaza really are dependent on whether or not Hamas stays in power. So with that, I'll stop the share here, and I will open it up if you have any questions. You have any questions, Luis?
I think I am in complete agreement with your point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
very, very interesting, the perception that Gaza is the one that needs to rethink things.
yeah, I mean, I tend to think that what you're going to see is an agreement made with the West Bank, and then some sort of agreement potentially separately with Gaza. I think that both of those agreements may well involve Arab countries working with Israel and the Palestinians that are involved. So you could see some sort of agreement that involves multiple Arab countries dealing with the Palestinian Authority on the one hand, and you could see an agreement that involves Qatar and potentially at some point Turkey, when it's not led by somebody who I think people would consider insane and not and hostile. But at some point it could be better, and those countries I think could work with Hamas. And I think that if they brought some stability, that you could see some sort of agreement. It would have to be an agreement with Israel and Egypt, so you're not talking about just Israel there. I think there's some concerns even for Jordan. I've talked about the fact that there are multiple people who would like to be in control of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Jordan currently controls it. The Palestinians would like to control it. Turkey has had a desire to control it as well because the Ottomans used to control it. But there's a fourth option right now that I think is increasing in desirability for the Israelis, which is basically to have Saudi Arabia come in and control it. They're at a distance. They're controlling the other major Palestinian, the other major Arab Muslim holy sites. If they were in control of it, it would help the Israeli-Saudi relationship significantly. So, I think that you have some developments that could happen in the future. That development would not be good for the Palestinians. So there are things that I think the countries involved, the groups involved, particularly the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and Jordan, all need to think about when they're talking about this process. There's still ways for it to get worse for them. I think Israel is in a very good position right now. I think Israel really has to look at how it maintains the possibility for the peace that it wants to see going forward. That will involve things like making sure that there is a viable amount of territory in Samaria, the northern part of the West Bank, and in Judea, in the south part of the West Bank, for a Palestinian state of some sort, for a Palestinian entity of some sort to really function long term, to have the ability to grow and prosper, even surrounded by Israel still, and that the situation in Gaza is kept in such a way that you have a possibility for some sort of independence long-term there that works. I mean, Gaza is functionally independent now, but it doesn't even have a really functional government, and Israel has to kind of figure out what relationship it would like, and Egypt has to figure out what relationship it would like with any leadership in Gaza going forward. So these things have to be kind of maintained and thought of, and to a certain extent, because the possibility of this going anywhere is really not high. These are on the back burner, or even totally out of the thought process. So at least regarding the West Bank, it still needs to be part of the thought process as to what Israel would like a peace to look like. And I think the Palestinians need to start figuring out, along with other Arab countries who I think are ahead of them in this, thinking about what it would look like, what they're willing to accept in order to have a long-term peace with Israel. And I think if I've kind of proposed what I think are reasonable parameters, but there are a lot of details that could happen in between that. The Trump peace proposal, I think, is actually somewhat in line with what I put forward. I think it's a little bit more extreme and a little less realistic, actually, on some of these things than I put forward. But you will see, activists on the Palestinian side will utterly reject what I put forward. They will say that it's totally unacceptable, not possible, on and on and on. But what I will tell you is, if you continue to try to do something that has failed time and time again, you're likely to fail time and time again. It's not going to be successful the next time. It's failed for decades. It's not going to be successful for decades to come. And the situation is continuing to get worse. So the more they push for a scenario that is not possible for Israel to accept, the less likely that anything good is going to come of it. So anyway, that's, I think, where we are. So thank you for joining me tonight, and I will talk to you soon.
Very good. Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Good night.